Hello and welcome to Paint with Freehand Lines. Today we'll be painting a really beautiful structure, the Great Kitchen in Durham. This is a lovely painting because it has a nice frame around it of trees and landscape. We'll be using a range of different size brushes. It doesn't matter what size as long as you have small to large. We'll also be using some special brushes. These are splayed brushes and these allow for really great foliage and little details later on in the process. And be really excited to share that bit with you. As for paints, these are the main paints I tend to use day to day when doing a building of natural stone. Yellow ochre and two browns, a lighter brown and a dark brown. That dark brown can be used either with the browns or the greens, again a light green and a dark green, something like olive green or sap green works really well. And I mix the dark brown to add depth and darkness for creating better and better tones. There's another paint I tend to use a lot of, and that's Payne's Grey. Now Payne's Grey can also be matched with the darker brown, and this will create blacker areas as well. So the only other colours, special colours that tend to be used quite often, is a light blue, and I'll use that for the sky. And the first process is actually applying the sky into the trees. Be quite loose about this. Allow yourself and the trees to flow, the paint to flow behind the trees. It really doesn't matter. I think watercolour should be a free and exciting thing to use. Next is the green. Now this is an olive green, it's a light green. It has almost a yellow feel, and it's perfect for the lighter bits of foliage. And you'll find this works well on grass and also on trees. So I tend to always start with a coat of this olive green, and this is how I start to layer up richer and richer greens, is by starting with the lightest colour and then move to darks. And that's a process I think you'll do throughout painting, and I think it's a really good process for watercolour. Start from light, work to dark. Once we've completed the green, I'm going to actually start on doing the actual tower itself using yellow ochre. Now watch the pattern of what I've done here. I've worked with the blue at the top, I've worked with the green at the bottom, and now I'm working with the middle bit. Now the reason for that is I'm allowing the paints to dry. It's always really important, I think, to allow watercolour to dry between layers. Now some people paint a lot of wet layers on top of each other, and that's really beautiful. But the simplest way to do watercolour is to do it in layers and allow it to dry. So here I'm washing just simply with yellow ochre, the main colour I tend to use for stone. Sometimes I'll add little bits of other brown in here. You can just dab them together, mix them, and you can layer it on. And you can allow the watercolour to flow. You'll see as I put the brush on, I get larger patches of watercolour, more dense, and as I brush it out, it gets lighter and lighter and lighter as you go. And that's okay, because we want it to be natural. Stone on a building is really consistent. Once that wash has dried, I now take a really light dab of Payne's Grey, and I start to using the wider brush, I start to dab on areas. This is starting to now layer up stone levels. Now what we're going to do is do this with different types of browns and colours. So using a slightly warmer brown, such as burnt sienna, I start to do the same process. I'm allowing little bits of drying time between each. You don't need to be crucial about this. You can see this is real time, so it gives you a really good idea for how the speed of painting is going. And here a bit more lighter now, a bit more lighter yellow ochre, a bit more pure yellow ochre, less washed down. And as you do this, you notice that those random layers over each one, over and over again, are creating this texture, this random texture to the stone. Now there's no depth to the stone because we haven't put shadows on, so that's okay. What we're doing now is we're building this up bit by bit, brush stroke by brush stroke. Now while I leave the stone to dry, what I'm going to do is start putting a bit more green on. Now this is again yellow ochre, and I'm just here adding some more tone to the base. This gives a little bit more depth, and makes it feel like behind the trees there is a well of light going towards the tower itself. Greens, pretty much like the stone, can work best when layered by adding more paint, allowing some time for drying between. Um, Over time, you get used to how much time you should allow for drying. Sometimes you want it completely dry, sometimes it can be damp and you get a little bit of runoff. Now here you can see I'm using a burnt sienna, or even a more warmer brown, again adding a little bit more texture to it, particularly to the building in the rear, to give a bit of differentiate between it and the tower. Browns continue. This time a smaller brush, getting a little bit more detail in there, a mid-range brush. I tend to use a lot of round brushes, but on occasion, we'll see in later videos, large flat brushes can be really brilliant at colouring various areas. I think it's just important to have a range of brushes. It doesn't really matter what size they are, as long as you have a range for different sizes of painting you do. Obviously, if you prefer miniatures, you can have a lot of smaller brushes. But my painting size, my paintings are usually about A3 size, so quite large. So I have a range of brushes that suits that size. Now you notice that the patterns of the stone are now becoming a little bit squarer, a little bit more defined, as I get the darker ones. And that's because if you look at a stone wall, you will notice there's lots of light tones across the stone, but occasionally you'll have a deeper stone around the edges. Now, when these go on, remember they will dry lighter, so they may come across dark, but they will dry lighter. And if you worry that, for example, they could be too dark, the simplest thing is just get a piece of kitchen towel and just dab them. That can actually create some fantastic effects, and we'll see that in some of the videos on my site. So continuing with the stone marking, this painting really is about the quality of the stone of this very simple building in the centre of the element, and that's why later on when the painting develops, we'll darken the edges of the painting to really bring out this little jewel of a building in the middle. Bit more darkers now, we're looking a bit more pain grey, adding those things, layering it up bit by bit. And this is a very relaxing thing to do. I tend to paint on boards. I can sit on the sofa, I can watch TV, I can listen to music, but it's quite a relaxing thing to do. And actually, as you get used to paintings drying and the drying times between them, you can also attempt to paint more than one painting at one site. I quite often paint 3 at a time, using similar colours, because painters tend to use similar blues and tend to have similar stone colours. So that's something you can try as you get a bit more expertise about it, and it's kind of relaxing because you never stop painting. You don't have to wait too much or get distracted. So you can now see that the building is now beginning to look quite aged, quite full of depth and detail. What were quite blank areas of drawing are now have a richness to them. My drawings tend to be quite detailed, but they don't actually have to be that way. You can actually keep it quite simple in terms of line drawings. and use the watercolour to add that detail. I find line drawings are particularly useful because it actually gives a bit more form to watercolour, because watercolour can lack form and it can look a little bit messy, and I think that's quite a nice character of the medium. But the pen is the opposite, so you get this masculine feminine elements, and together they work really well. Now we're moving towards the bushes. Now the bushes tend to be quite dark greens, so what we've done here is we've mixed the olive green, you can see the yellow side of the olive green, with some sap green, and I've added in some of the raw umber, the brown. Now I use tubes. I find tubes are much easier to use, and I'll create dollops of those colours next to each other, and I'll mix them on a palette to the right consistency, and then I'll apply them and layer them, etc. And I can just add a little bit more brown, a little bit more green as I feel I need. So moving to the trees now. Now I'm using purely olive green here. There is probably a slight bit of brown in it, but effectively this is very dense paint because I've used tubes. I can add water, just a little water, and I can start to dab that on. So the intensity of this is more than the grass. Grass tends to be a little bit calmer. The new saplings of a tree tend to be more intense green. So my point here is now to add those bits on around the edges of the tree. And the saplings tend to be lighter around the edges and darker in the middle. Those colours match. Interesting thinking of background bushes, they need to be a little bit lighter still. So you've got this tonal difference here with these four greens that you can see at the moment. You've got the lightest, which is the grass. You've got the darkest, which are the bushes. You've got this in between, which is the background bushes, because we want to keep a bit of distance. And then on the trees at top, we have this intense green, which really is quite vibrant. Here's the opportunity just to pick up any parts that I've missed. You'll find with my watercolours, I purposefully avoid any areas of white. Many people paint and they will leave white edges to all the watercolours between different bits of watercolour. It can look quite beautiful. I prefer not to have those white bits. I think if the paint all flows together and you have complete colour, your eye gets a little bit immersed into that image and sees the white of the paper around it as more of background. And I think if you leave the white gaps between, it becomes about a series of pools of paint on a piece of paper. So I like people to be a bit more immersed into the image if possible. So taking the opportunity now while some of the paint dries, the green dry, to go back to the main building and then patter on more and more paint to get that a bit deeper still. Now I'm specifically looking with the darks, the Payne's grey, at how the building is aged. Now, before we were layering browns, those were the natural browns of the actual building, and now what we'll be doing as the base colour is coming together is we will start layering depths of aging, shading, shadows as we go. So now you can see, I'm now adding more greens. I'm actually adding a little bit of Payne's grey into the greens now to get some darks now, just as I started to do with the tower. Remember that, when you look at trees, you will see the green elements of the edges, but generally because the sky is lighter behind, that the tree itself will be in shade. So you'll see lots of darks surrounding it. And the power of having darks around the outside of a painting is that it really makes the inside glow. You have a feeling that you're standing somewhere that's shaded and looking somewhere that's light beyond. That brings the viewer into the painting. Continuing with the darks now, fading them out, completing the surround around the painting. You now start to have a feel for how the painting's got to look. And you get to a point, and it's a really lovely point, when you realise that actually now you're in a situation where you just have to layer more paint on to get the depths that you need. So introducing the splayed brush now. Now you can see the splayed brush, I've added darks, the Payne's grey, and I dabbed it into the Payne's grey, and I'm starting to dab it onto the actual painting. And you can see the effect of this, and lots of little dots, really great at creating foliage. And you know, I can use this right around the edge to really add that detail. The other thing that's really good about this brush is that if you add really quite raw paint to it, quite dense paint, it gives you those depths, so you can see the lighter greys and the darker blacks kind of give a depth to that painting. And it's really great for foliage, leaves, just dot along for leaves, but it's also fantastic for grasses, and we'll see some of that later in some of my other videos. Adding more darks now to the trees and the bushes. So it reaches a point with the painting where you've kind of covered off most of the base colours. You've added the depth you need, and there then comes a point where you just start to add shading. Now shading and shadows can be everywhere. Quite often a glass, as you look into a room, is dark. Sometimes it reflects the sky, but quite often it's a dark colour. So again, Payne's grey comes in really, really useful for that. So I'm adding those bits in now. I'm just filling in the path at the back and just making sure that's in. Again, it tends to be a similar colour to the yellow ochre, and picking up any last bits that I may have left is, as I mentioned earlier, very important to make sure there's no white gaps in my paintings, that everything is covered in paint, that in the central area of the painting, so it's one uniform element that kind of sits within the paper. Using up less bits of paint and starting to get some depth now, to create the 3D effect. Shadows are crucial. Even now it looks quite flat, but that's going to change very rapidly as we move on to creating shadows. So here's the first bits of the shadows now picking up the side of the building. Again, this is purely Payne's grey. You can sometimes add browns. It can be a bit warmer, but and you can experiment with that. But you know, Payne's grey is pretty good at giving you an ideal shadow. So starting with the horizontals, getting those light shadows in. There is something called speculation and ray tracing with shadows, where shadows, there's two types of shadow. There's kind of a dark shadow, but also a reflection of light from the ground back up to the shadow. So because of that, I kind of start with a light wash of shadows, and fading that out around the edges a little bit. To fade out, by the way, is two ways of doing it. One is to wash the brush and add a bit of water on the end, and then finish the edge of that brush stroke. That can work well, but it can also dry and create a tide mark of water around it. Another simpler way is just wring out a bit of the paint on your finger and put the brush back over. That will just suck up a little bit of paint on the edge, and it will keep it much drier and more controlled. Now adding the same Payne's grey around the bottom of the painting. Remember, we've got those trees above, and those trees are creating shadow on the ground plane. This is really important to get that 3D feel, and also to frame the painting. So what we're doing here is we're actually painting up, sticking that grey on layer by layer and fading it out around the edge. I think it's always important that the painting, because the painting is dense, as I said, it's consistent, that the edges of it kind of flow and actually create a composition in themselves, so it looks good on the paper. I tend to frame my paintings without borders, not cropping in. So the actual object, the painting on the paper itself as a form, becomes quite important to be compositionally beautiful. Now the grey's dried a little bit more in the middle, I'll now add a little bit more, working up those greys, just as we did with the browns, to create something that has real depth. So, again, more. And now you're seeing that the kind of blanked out window is beginning to come alive. You can start to see the depth, you can start to see the shadows, you can start to feel that this is a three-dimensional building. Heavier darks now coming into the painting, picking up again. I tend to start with the horizontals first, just to give it a structure. I'm also taking this opportunity to add a few little dark bits to the odd bit of element that sticks out horizontally. That kind of gives again that little bit of detail. Remember, when you add ink or watercolour, you put it on and it does dry, and when it dries it takes probably about 30% to 50% of the colour out with it. So layering a little bit and then we're seeing what happens and layering again not only gives a palimpsest of colour and depth, but it also allows you control to make sure you don't overdo the watercolour. And you can see now I'm adding more and more dark, and it's just a gradual process of making it richer and richer to get it to the right level that makes it feel like it's the building it wants to be. Now using the splayed brush for grass. Slightly different process here, not massively different than when we were doing the foliage, but a bit more horizontal in its nature, whereas trees tend to have groups of foliage together. The grass tends to have patches of longer grass, usually horizontal in nature, with a widening in the middle and then going out, so you can kind of see that's what I've done now. I'm also using the opportunity to take that brush to feather the kind of the barrier, the boundary between the grass and the bushes, and then I'm back to shadows and creating darks. Still using a relatively larger brush, kind of mid-range I'd say, to get those darks in. This is not sort of the painting I'll use a small brush very often, because it's stone, it's ancient stone, it's this one's about 1,000 years old. It's weathered, it kind of needs those a large brush is usually quite good. I tend to go as large as I can on a painting at all times. It's quicker, and it kind of just doesn't make you get too into the detail too early. You kind of want to watercolour down, move on, keep it going. It's fun, and it should be fun, and it also gives a natural feel to the watercolour. Here I'm putting shadows on and dotting those shadows in, and now I'll fade a little bit of those shadows down, etc. Now, because I'm putting so many greys on top of each other, it's probably not drying completely, so some of this is then blurring in, which is a nice effect, but it's doing it in a way that's quite controlled. Picking up a few bits of stone detail. And just increasing that depth. to darkening the grass, increasing the shadows. And this is the process really now. We're just adding tone, adding darks to create a richness and to define the building a little bit more in its setting. And here comes the detail brush. Now we're getting close to the end of the painting, we can start to get in the details. And on this painting, the details really the branches that hold up the bush. So using that with brown, some of the burnt umber, the brown mixed with the black to just get that definition. And then we have the completed painting. And there you have it. Well done. It's quite a simple painting, but quite effective, with really nice mixtures of greens and a really warm stone colour that has a real depth and age to it. So thank you, and tune in for more. There'll be more on the website and more coming soon.